Most powerlifting programs will have some form of progression through the block. But here's the thing, if you're progressing every session in your training week, you might be doing it wrong. So here's the thing, just because you can increase the intensity and volume on all of the days, doesn't mean that you should. And this one mistake is where a lot of lifters stall their progress early in the block. So in this video, we are going to tackle the question of, should you progress all training days in powerlifting? If you're new here, my name is Norman Chung and I've been coaching powerlifting for over 13 years. And in this video, I'll show you exactly how I think about whether to progress all of the training days, how I decide which days get progressions, if not all, and which days stay flat on purpose. But before we dive into it, we need to define some things. Let's actually define what we mean by progress and progression in the context of training days. Now, progress is the outcome. It's the improvement in performance that you see over time. Importantly, in the program, think estimated 1 rep max. Now, progression on the other hand is the input. Think increase in training stimulus or dose. Now, this could be in a form of volume, intensity, or both. And you want to be thinking average or peak intensity or total reps. So what do we actually mean by progressing training days? Now, progression doesn't always mean adding absolute load every week. We have to think about the relative stimulus. Now, it could be increasing the relative intensity, i.e. RPE. It could be increasing the absolute intensity, i.e. percentage, or increasing the volume, i.e. total reps. In this case, increasing the RPE actually increases the absolute intensity. So here's the really important thing. We have to really understand that there's a fundamental difference between progress and progression. You do not necessarily need progression for a training program or session to bring about progress. This is because the stimulus may already be sufficient to stimulate the body to get stronger. So remember this, the presence and ability to lift heavier weights is a result of past overload, not the necessity for future overload. This is particularly important if you are prescribing percentages of a fixed 1 rep max. So here's what matters. If you increase load every week, it can mean that you are making progress, especially if the estimated 1 rep max support this as well. However, the relative stimulus might be consistent. For example, if you're doing 1x5 at RP6 every week and the load is increasing, in this case, it means that the relative stimulus is constant and it is sufficient to bring about adaptations as the 1x5 at RP6 stimulus is sufficient overload. However, by increasing load every week, it can also mean that you are forcing overload and that relative intensity is actually going up. It's entirely possible that your E1 rem may go up at a certain point, but then go downwards afterwards. So why do we even bother with progression in the first place? At the definitional level, progression isn't always about driving adaptation. It's about driving stimulus. And if we are doing that intelligently, that new stimulus will drive positive adaptation. As the person writing the training program, we don't actually have that much control over what adaptation happens. We can never know for absolute certainty how an athlete will respond to a certain stimulus in the immediate future. Yes, we can find something that works repeatedly for a long period of time, but that will eventually change. When that will actually happen will be unpredictable. All we can do as coaches is manipulate the training variables to provide the right level of stimulus, fundamentally the environment, one that's high enough to trigger adaptation, but not so high that it overwhelms recovery. And in reality, we only get to react when we know that something doesn't really work anymore. By progressing certain variables like increasing the RP slightly, we ensure that it's appropriate for where the athlete is right now in their recovery and readiness cycle. So let's actually dive into the case for progressing all of the training days. Now, there is a strong case for progressing all of the sessions, at least as a starting point when designing a new mesocycle. Why? Because progressing all training days can help you find the maximal recoverable dose of a microcycle more effectively. It pushes the athlete gradually across all the sessions, which helps you identify when performance plateaus or start to decline on a mesocycle scale. And this gives you a clear dose response picture. This further gives you a bit more clarity on how you may refine the progression in subsequent training blocks. You can then see where fatigue is building, where performance peaks, and where it starts to break down. Another interesting thing is, if you're progressing all the sessions, you might notice that the primary day stops being the strongest day from too much fatigue from the previous non-primary days. And that shift in relative performance can tell you a lot about the recovery and stimulus distribution of each session. But let's be clear, progressing all sessions doesn't mean cranking everything up by the same amount. One day might go up by 1 RPE, but another by 0.5 RPE. And you can bias the progression to one day more than others depending on the purpose of the program and the sessions. Also, when it comes to progressing all of the days, it doesn't necessarily mean progressing all of the sets. You could progress just the top set of one day and then the back off sets on another day, and it's not that binary. Some lifters mentally thrive on seeing weekly progression on all the sessions everywhere, even with the smallest jumps. Yes, it's true that you shouldn't necessarily just progress the sessions purely for the fun of intensity, but that doesn't mean that you can't do it in a way that still preserves good control over the overall stimulus stimulus throughout the whole block. Choosing a progression strategy isn't just physiological, it can be psychological as well. That said, there are good reasons not to progress all of the training days, and honestly, this applies to a lot of more experienced lifters as well, because these more experienced lifters can potentially have higher levels of training frequency for some lifts. And so for some, progressing everything too fast can lead to early fatigue, which means shorter training blocks and more volatile readiness and performance peaks and troughs that are hard to manage. Depending on your philosophy, there are some sessions in the program that can be designed as primer days, where you have lighter exposures that are still contributing to the overall stimulus but let the athlete recover from heavier sessions. Also, keeping some days static can give you a reliable apples to apples comparison across the training weeks, and this acts like a performance thermometer, and you'll know when progressing certain days are creating too much fatigue, because the static days performance will start to plateau or decline. Specifically, you can be monitoring what the E1RM does on those static days. And lastly, in most cases, you want to protect the athlete's best performance for their primary day. For most people, that's going to be the competition lift day or the most specific variation. Here's an important scientific observation of adaptations. There is fundamentally a decaying effect of strength training sessions. Basically, the performance of one training session isn't just influenced by the previous single session, but all of the sessions before that as well, but to an exponentially decaying level. For this reason, you don't necessarily need to feel the effects of progressing the last session. Increasing the stimulus in the session before it can be enough to maintain an overall higher training stimulus leading up to that current session. So, not only is the performance of today's session a reflection upon the effects of the last session, but the sessions from the span of last several days and weeks as well. What I'm describing here is essentially the principle of residual training effects combined with the exponential decay of stimulus influence. Here's a thought experiment to help you understand this. If you had identical twins and one of them completed a week of hard weight training while the other did nothing, and both waited a month before testing a 1 rep max, you could be confident that the trained twin would likely still have a higher 1 rep max, even though that they would have been somewhat detrained since. And because of this, you can understand how the effects of training can still be very long lasting. One important thing to understand is that planning progression on all days can sometimes give the illusion of control. Just because you plan to progress doesn't mean that the body will adapt as expected. Biological systems are pretty noisy, so even if you plan progression across all the days, the real output may vary depending on various different factors. So if you are progressing all the days, make sure it's not just in an illusion of forward motion. You still need to monitor the response and not just execute a plan. So if you are going to progress some of the sessions, which sessions should you progress? In this context, we are going to be talking about whether to progress primary days or non-primary days. In this case, we define primary days as days that you want to be strongest, normally with the highest top end exposure. So let's talk about the case for progressing just a primary day. In this scenario, you're essentially prioritizing performance on the main lifts without letting fatigue from other days interfere. This works really well when you're building towards top end exposure, especially in a peak and taper block. In this case, you're not necessarily trying to build new strength levels anymore. You're managing fatigue and sharpening performance. Also, if your non-primary days are already sufficiently stimulating, you don't need to progress them at all. You're just preserving your best efforts for the days that matter the most. You could also prioritize progression on only the primary days because you know that the rest of the week is already known to be a stimulating dose of volume and intensity. As a result, progression in just a primary day still leads to an overall progression in the whole microcycle as a whole. So let's talk about the case of progressing the non-primary days and keeping the primary day flat. Some blocks might involve keeping the primary day static, especially if you want to maintain consistency in performance tracking and then progressing only the non-primary days. Typically, you may do this to accumulate work from higher volume days or address weak points without overloading the heavier sessions. Why? Because you already know that the primary day hits hard, so the non-primary days become a sandbox to test different doses. You basically get a controlled environment to experiment without sacrificing the quality of your key session. You may also have the goal to reduce psychological fatigue from constant high stress from the heavy competition lifts. And this may be a more useful strategy if you are really far out from competition, so in the off season. You may also adapt this strategy for intensity sensitive athletes, assuming that the non-primary days have considerably lower intensity. So going back to the original question, should you progress all the training days? Honestly, it depends on the athlete, the phase, and the intent behind each session. There is no single rule here, but understanding the purpose of each day and using progression strategically, you will get better results than just progressing all the days for the sake of it. Now, if you found this video useful, please click like and subscribe, and I'll see you guys on the next one.